Marshall and Sagar here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. We've got a great return guest today. Balaji Srinivasan has just released a new book. It's called The Network State. I'm not going to be able to do it any justice, so I will read you all the description to describe his work. Technology has enabled us to start new companies, new communities, and new currencies. But can we start new cities or even new countries? This book explains how to build the successor to the nation state, a concept we call the network state. Balaji's work goes a bunch of different directions, especially when it comes to technology and claims about cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin. So Sagar and I decided to take a slightly different angle with him. A lot of folks like Tim Ferriss are going to do interviews with Balaji where they're going to focus on the technology and those bits. Instead, we took a step back and focused more on Balaji's ideology, what drives him, how he thinks about the United States, how he thinks about China, how he thinks about American political debates, even Chinese internal political debates themselves. So lots of really great stuff here. Hope you enjoy this interview. If you want a more technically focused one, there are a bunch of other ones we'd really recommend to you all there, of course. Last but not least, would love for anyone who enjoyed this longer of a normal episode and any of our additional content to subscribe to the Realignment. You can go to realignment.supercast.com or go to the link at the top of your show notes. And if you are a new person, we would love for you to subscribe to the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. You should get a link in that for supporting our work. Hope you enjoy this episode. Balaji Srinivasan, welcome back to the Realignment.
Good to be here.
Yeah, it's good to see you.
It's great to see you. We've had you on 2 times before, but this is the first time you have a book, not to hawk because the PDF is available online for free. People should go check that out, but also supporting authors' works is important from my perspective. I got the Kindle pre-order as well too. Let's just start there. Why did you write a book?
Good question. So, it's funny because there's my friend Naval has this saying, which is like most books should be essays and most essays should be article, like short, and most of those should just be a single tweet, right? And most essays should be tweets forms and most tweets forms should be tweets. And I think that's true. But I think what's also interesting is just sort of over the years, you write things, you kind of build up a conceptual framework, and you do need more than 280 characters or even an essay to explain it. It's kind of like the difference between writing a short program versus one for a large website like an Instagram or a Facebook. And all of those submodules that you sort of debugged and open, on Twitter. Okay, that snippet of verbal code, that works. This snippet works. Okay, I got this wrong and somebody corrected me on this. So, okay, my facts are right here or my logic wasn't exactly tight. All of those little bits of libraries and so on kind of pull this together into a larger program. And that is kind of what this book, The Network State, is.
Yeah. Well, why don't we start then with the network state? I love the way that you have it set up, which is the network state in one sentence, one image, 1,000 words in one essay. Maybe start first with why deciding to even start with that type of structure for readers who are going to go on your website and then delve into some of the content.
Totally. So the website, you can reach it at thenetworkstate.com. And I did a few things. We did a few things with it. So basically, first it is not just globally accessible in PDF, but also we tried to mobile optimize it. So even if you've got like a Android phone in Nigeria or India or Brazil or something like that, you can read it. And then we'll launch translations and stuff like that. Let me just kind of talk about the book app itself first, and then the thing itself, right? So, books are thought of as static traditionally, right? And apps are thought of as dynamic. And I think of this as a book app that sort of kind of marries the two. And of course, people have kind of talked about this forever. In fact, HTML actually, do you know it comes from book markup languages?
Oh, I didn't know that. No.
Yeah, actually, if you're a coder, if you talk to an engineer, it's this linear format that has, like P tags and B tags and so on, right? So those are actually like markup for text that essentially got turned into a language for laying out 2D boxes and 3D virtual reality stuff, VRML, all this other stuff, right?
Wow.
But its origins are on marking up documents. And in fact, the most basic unstyled HTML page you've probably seen is just like bold font, Times New Roman, what have you, like an academic's web page is like that. So, one of the themes actually of the book is actually sort of reunifying tech and media in a sense, where you had, sort of the amoral, apps, right? Utility based. And then you have the ultra-moral, preachy, impractical, pure media, and you put those together into a book app, right? The app and the book. Okay. So then what are we actually doing in terms of the kind of tech on it? So I kind of think of, by the way, this book is like very much a V1. And I'm going to be shipping significant updates to it. It might like double in length by the time I'm done with it. And because there's so many appendices and footnotes and footnotes to the footnotes and so on. But I tried to get at least a through line of the argument and then expand on it. Like, lots of alternate endings and stuff like that in there in the sci-fi scenario that I'll talk about. And then moreover, you know how like Satoshi's white paper sort of launched Bitcoin, right?
Yes.
There was sort of this, right? And I think that concept of a thesis statement beforehand is also, lots of startups are launched by slide decks, right? Lots of movements are launched by books. In particular with Theodor Herzl, like Der Judenstaat is actually what built Zionism and built Israel. And I kind of think that the next step after companies and coins is communities. And communities actually, as I'll get to, they kind of start with a moral innovation as opposed to a technological innovation. That kind of requires you to sort of write in a book. So this book app is kind of like that. Anyway, so that's kind of the concept of the book app. So you can kind of go and check it out there. And it's free online. Take a look. You know why we listed on Amazon? It's actually, it's funny.
For the charts?
Amazon, huh?
For the charts or the distribution?
No, well, so that's the thing is actually, the Amazon is actually our nod to the traditional world. Okay.
Smart.
Like, I kind of think of this as, maybe, if we can get it all done, we wanted to have this be a book 3 kind of thing, like Web3, book 3, where we have embedded crypto stuff in there, like little widgets and so on, all the stuff that you can't really do within the confines of Kindle, let alone within a physical book. But just to talk about that for a second, like, all the bestseller lists, did you know that the NYT bestseller list, for example, is actually an editorial product that's fake?
Yeah, I did know that. Yeah, because my own book had the same problem, which is that it actually sold well enough copies, but it didn't sell the right amount of copies in the right amount of stores in order to hit the list.
So William Blatty in the 80s, do you know about this whole story?
No, I don't. Go, please.
Okay. Yeah. So he is the author of The Exorcist, and he had a second book, I think Legion, came out. There's a thing on this online, but essentially he said, wait a second, it's on the bestseller list. And he sued the New York Times, and they actually defended themselves in court saying, actually, this bestseller list is a work of opinion. Okay. So it's actually the most charitable thing is it's analogous to like Google's rankings or whatever, but it's fake like much other stuff in the paper, basically. Right. And so it's really an editorial product where what they want to rank high is high and what they don't want to rank high is not high. And, at least Google is a little more straightforward about that, but this is not actually a bestseller. So the thing is that you don't even want to, so first of all, that ranking isn't a fair ranking. You can't, win a game, et cetera. So don't play a game like that, sort of rigged like that. But the second thing is actually even bestseller. If the goal is not to sell books but to build a community, even that would be the wrong metric. You don't want number of sales. You want number of installs or number of, like companies or things started off of it. I don't know if you've heard this line. It's common in tech, like the most successful media company of the 2010s is A16Z.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Because it built this giant media arm online, all this content marketing, you might call it. And the thing is, rather than, let's say, BuzzFeed, which is trying to go for 1 million viewers on a given post, they're trying to find the one person that they'd invest $1 million in. And that's actually a more lucrative long-term business model, much more so, right? Because rather than getting a penny per click and having to have this lowest common denominator kind of thing, instead you're going after the one person who in 10 years will return a large amount of money. And it means your writing style completely changes. You're writing for the best, not the most. Right? You're writing for that person who's crucially, you're not writing it in a sycophantic, it's not like corporate propaganda or anything like that, because you're still analyzing the situation. You're analyzing the situation in its complexity for that CEO or founder or, person with initiative who can come in and fix a situation. And maybe there's, 100, 200 people on the planet for any one domain that has that. But that person is actually more than kind of writing it in the stupid lowest common denominator. Go after for example, Biden talking about gas prices and encouraging people to mob like immigrant gas station owners who make like 1 cent per gallon or something like that. That's the most superficial, stupid analysis of the problem, that you could have, as opposed to here is the entire gas supply chain. Here are the edits we can make on it. And that's just like a discussion for adults. It doesn't fit into 140 characters, right? So that kind of media is the kind of media I'm more interested in for the best rather than the most. And then I think that actually also makes money over time. And that's what subsidizes it in the medium to long run. Okay, maybe a little digressive, but go ahead.
Yeah. So here's the question. I really like how you set up the Bitcoin white paper as the analogy for what you're doing here. So, I'm sure when people go to the network state website, the lines that are going to stick out in the description are, but can we start new cities or even new countries? So to understand this project then, is your ambition here to, and this was released on July 4th, so there's something there going on, right? Is your ambition that this body of work on the network state leads to like an increase in new countries, a new conception of countries? Introduce that part of the project.
Totally. And so the thing is, one thing I want to say is I'm not trying to build in any way a competitor to Bitcoin. The Bitcoin white paper is inspiration, but so is the Constitution, so is Theodor Herzl's Der Judenstaat, so is actually India's nonviolent independence. Actually, if there's 4 countries that sort of inspire this, certainly America with the Constitution, the Declaration, but actually also India, Israel, and Singapore in different ways. Israel, as I mentioned, it was started with a book. India, because it got its nonviolence mostly independently, which I think is a very important sort of, way of thinking about things. And Singapore, because it has a CEO, it had a genuine founder, a CEO. And the thing is, all 4 of those, most people don't think of it this way, but America, India, Israel, and Singapore are all sort of forks of the UK's code base. Right. And you can kind of take them in different ways.
Like common law. I understand what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. And even if you do change out the common law for the Constitution, like in the US, there is a set of antecedents. Obviously, these are all for English speaking countries, but they were all at one point British colonies. They all, they all have friendly-ish relations, very friendly relations with the UK. And, but they're independent. And this is actually a point that, I'm adding in like an expansion essay is often today, things are phrased as being either you're pro-American or anti-American. And I think actually that rhetoric is going to amp up in the years to come. But, we don't actually ask, are Americans pro-British or anti-British? Are Indians pro-British or anti-British? Israelis pro-British, right? Singaporeans, because they, in a sense, they were pro-independence. But once they had independence, they were moving along their own z-axis, right? They were not anti-British. In fact, they had a lot of respect for Britain. They had respect for, Newton and all the things Britain brought to the planet. Sure, they had their beefs around the time of colonialism, but you know what? Once there was a little bit of distance, there was mutual respect, there was trade and so on both sides, right? In the same way, I think, like insofar as I have criticisms of the US establishment and so on and so forth, it's similar to, somebody who's like, okay, look, America did a lot of great things, man on the moon. And, do I need to list all the accomplishments, everything from the internal combustion engine, you could just spend a whole thing just on that. Right. And in the same way that I respect Britain, I respect America, but I also think that we can found new countries. We can do new things. I mean, actually, there was a quote by Jefferson, like a new constitution needs to be written every 20 years. And the non-obvious point is that if you can't found new things, you can't even maintain existing ones. You know why?
Why?
Because let's say you have a car and like one screw goes missing. Well, you need somebody who kind of knows how the car was built to even maintain it.
Yes.
It's not necessarily that you need to build the whole thing from scratch, but you need to kind of understand how a car works to be able, and it's somebody in that supply chain needs to understand how it was built from scratch. And maybe they need to even machine a new part or something, or at least get one off the shelf. Right. And so the thing is, in many ways, we sort of live amidst the ruins of a civilization. Like America today, it's almost like living amidst Stonehenge. Okay. Where there were all these structures that were set up by guys in the post-war era and so on. And now you can see that it's like American civilization is like a record on loop. It's Top Gun infinity. It's, 75 or 80-year-old politicians on both the Democrat and Republican side. It is NIH investigators. They are, like the academics who are getting grants. Patrick Collison tweeted this. I've seen this for many years, but it's like the same cohort of people that just gets older, but they keep getting all the grant money. Or you look at the leading people in Hollywood movies, and the number of leading people who are, under 30 has like fallen off a cliff, and those over 60 has risen. And it's like a civilization that's kind of hanging on to the post-war order and its past glories sort of by its fingernails because it's scared of what comes next. It's pathologized what comes next. It said these tech guys are evil, all that stuff is evil, and so on and so forth. And to give the alternative thing on this, actually, to my great surprise, where one possible alternative to this is actually India. And the reason
you've been talking a lot about this.
All right. So this thread, basically, it kind of just makes 4 points, right? It's not really about the crypto thing. It's that, India, if you read their budget, it's talking about digital universities and drone farms and telemedicine and open source and all this stuff. And it is something where if you compare that, Michael Solana has this post called $1 Trillion Paint Job. If you compare that to the US budget from 8 months earlier, it's completely night and day, right? And then you also take a look at like Sanjeev Sanyal's like Economic Survey of India, or which is linked in that post, or Last Contrarian has some images of like American train stations versus Indian train stations, or tigerfeathers.substack.com has this post called The Internet Country. I'm not talking about any one thing, okay? But what I'm talking about is I'm seeing as like an investor, the totality of graphs are, to my great surprise, basically pointing up and to the right broadly in India in a way that I think is really, for the first 35-ish years of my life, I really wasn't paying that much attention. And now it's like kind of going vertical. So that's just something to keep an eye on, because it's an English speaking country that is going to be the majority of English speakers on the internet, if it isn't already. So do you know about that?
So yeah. So quick follow-up question on this, because on two different fronts. So number one would just be, I'm curious how you think about this American like civilizational rot, like decline narrative.
Sure.
Because as you know, obviously we could look at the world in 1977 and list a lot of situations which are far worse, right? So not just like talk of like inflation, but like actual like stagflation, actual defeat in Vietnam where 58,000 American troops die, Watergate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, on and on and on and on.
Right.
How do you, when you're making this kind of bear case for America, and we'll get into American anarchy in a bit, how do you make that bear case while also acknowledging that predictions of America's demise have always undercounted fundamental strengths and ability to reconstitute itself, no matter how bad things actually are?
Extremely good question. Actually, the way I'm going to sort of look in my V2 of the book, hopefully I'll be done with that in a few. I'll push it in stages or whatever. Yeah. My V2, the way I'm actually setting it up is it's like problem and solution. Okay. So the problem is how, my kind of theory of past, present, future, my whole worldview, how I think about left and right, how I think about things flipping back and forth. I think about the rise of Asia, decline of US political institutions, being post-American, like being post-British, but not anti-American, all of those things. Think of that as like a problem statement. And then I think the solution to that I propose is startup societies and network states. Rather than just hoping that somebody in government can figure it out. Well, at your company or at the organization you're running, you don't just hope someone else is going to figure it out. You go and do it yourself, and how would you actually go about that? Well, without leading a war or a revolution, that's actually the innovation, hopefully, right? Sort of like, you can't trust the Federal Reserve to reform. How does Satoshi figure out a reform to that? You can't trust Blockbuster or BlackBerry or Barnes and Nobles to reform. How do you figure that out? So that delta, that exit is actually, a big part of the trick. So one way of thinking about it, it's like, if X, then Y. If you believe in this problem statement, then here's a solution. Now, there's many variations of that. You may not even believe there's a problem at all, right? So if you are a member of the US establishment, if you're a member of the CCP establishment, the Chinese establishment, then you don't think there's a problem at all. So you don't even think there's a need for a solution. So therefore everything is great. America was always great. Hillary Clinton, woo, 2024 or whatever it is, right? Or whoever it's going to be. Okay. Or, you might think, well, it's a problem, but the solution is just more elections and, like just the existing processes we've gone through before, we'll get through it again. Okay. Even still, you might find value in X, even if you disagree with Y, because X might have pieces. It's like got submodules. See that it's in some ways, this is the opposite of a Bible because it's like a toolbox. So if I have got, 100 subsections and 10 of those or 5 of those are useful lenses to you, well, I've hopefully given you some utility. That's the concept there, right? So even if you don't agree with it in toto, you might be able to take submodules, subpieces, just like a software library. Then there's more different ways of thinking about it. So like you might agree with X, but disagree with what the solution should be. So some people say, okay, the answer is, yes, there's all this polarization, all these problems. The answer is, the blues might call it blue democracy. Opponents might call it blue censorship. The reds might say the solution is red monarchy. Opponents might call it red dictatorship. Okay. And they say, well, actually the answer, is, there's this article from 2018 that I talk about in that we've seen one side must win. The Peter, I think.
Hey, Balaji, this is great. I'm doing an interview with Peter later today. for the
Peter
show.
Leiden?
Yeah, so this is gonna sync up well. That's great.
Great. So here's the thing. Actually, like, his whole article in 2018, which was actually retweeted by Jack Dorsey and Evan Williams. Even if I disagree with him on many particulars in terms of, like, I don't think California is well managed and so on and so forth, I do agree that that is a victory condition. Like the win scenario of blue ideological victory, if you can, whether you call it censor, deplatform, or they would say stopping disinformation, misinformation, whatever. If you can just kind of stop that red mind virus, boom, done. You can win a non-violent ideological victory. And then, we continue progressing forward to, greater equality. Okay. And then the alternative, I'm giving the most neutral,
No. I mean, because the quick thing is, up until now, that's basically the directional American story.
Yeah.
So like that like the way you articulated that's not insane.
It's not. That's right. And that's actually one of the things I have in here is you heard the term base rater, BASE. Okay. So Tyler Cohen talks about this concept of the base rate person. It's like they basically assume that the base rate is the same and you're just getting too excited about stuff. Lol, tech bro, a bus, you invented a bus. There's nothing new under the sun. Oh, this time is different, huh? Okay. Like that kind of person basically feels, the opposite of this time is different is nothing will ever change, and that the base rate person, the base rate fallacy is to assume that, nothing will ever change. Then but one of the alternate endings that I have, I'm not sure if I actually shipped it yet, but I will, is the base rate fallacy. Just because things can't change don't mean they do. And then you have to obviously weigh the probabilities. I know it's sort of like a rhetorical back and forth, right? So absolutely, there's a huge, inertia for any establishment kind of organization. I mean, think about Microsoft. How many people said Microsoft sucks, right? Microsoft sucks, Microsoft. But you know what? It's really, 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 really hard to write an operating system. Insanely difficult to write an operating system. So in the early 2000s, I'm not sure if you guys were in your like elementary school years or something like that.
We were there for Windows XP. And we saw Vista. We know what happened.
I remember Windows 95. Yeah. But
okay.
Anyway, good. Yeah.
Fine. Okay. So you're cognizant, right? So, basically when I was like a teenager, the thing is that tech actually had a moral component to it then. The moral component was Microsoft is a giant bad corporation. We are Linux. We are open source. And that is actually something which has now been totally forgotten about because that actually gave a moral kind of thing. Microsoft bad, Linux and open source good. Therefore, we're the moral revolutionaries. We're actually the good guys. And so there was a revolutionary zeal that was absolutely real. And the thing is, Microsoft was very powerful at that time in the late 90s, early 2000s. And coding a new operating system, it's very easy to complain about something. It's really hard to do it. It's really hard to do something that's even better than the incumbent and to get a distribution when that incumbent is nasty. And yet somehow Microsoft did suck enough that Linux got through and it built up Google and Facebook and so on. And Apple got through and then Mac OS and iPhone. And it still took like 10 years. And then Microsoft managed as a function of that to have a Satya figure who and it's complicated. Basically, the fact that Google and Apple were successful internally gave the internal momentum for Microsoft's rejuvenation and reform, sort of like how Singapore and Hong Kong and Taiwan helped reform China because Deng came to power and then he reformed China. So point being, without that external signal, without those guys who didn't just say Microsoft sucked, but actually built something better than the most valuable company in technology at that time, right? Which is a very, very difficult thing to do. It's like, oh, LeBron, you suck, you're missing a shot. Okay, do something better than that, right? That's actually wildly more difficult than critiquing. That was done. And when it was done, not only did it cause some reform in Microsoft, it was also just shown how really difficult it is to do that. So that is an argument in favor of the base raters, which is, you know what, as much as they suck, as much as like current management sucks, what is the alternative, right? And one of the things I talk about is there's actually two alternatives that are coming, which I actually don't think are great. And I talk about that. Should I talk about like this NYT, CCP, BTC?
Yeah, that was my next. Well, okay.
Could I ask you one more question on this front, which I'm really interested in. So yes. We're playing around with this successor to the British point on these four countries. And I know you know this, but there's the famous quote, I forget from who, like after World War II, where a British statesman said, the Americans are the Romans to our Greeks. So like, this is the story the British tell themselves about how it's the successor. It's different, it's coarser, it's more rough, but there's something there. Common law, taking over the empire, the global policing role, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What I'm curious about, though, is tension points within that. So to your point, we don't have beef with the British now, but there was 200 years where there was a lot of beef. We almost fought a bunch of wars with them. There was a war plan to invade Canada, like as late as like the 1910s. A lot of Americans like weren't exactly in favor of joining the Allied side in World War I because they were German immigrants, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The Monroe Doctrine. And after World War II, their empire is dead. So those debates are just over. It doesn't matter. Colonialism's dead. Where are the tension points that are going to have to exist for a while until something basically comes to a head?
Okay. So you want my totally crazy, out of the money kind of bet that I kind of always you want that? Okay,
yeah.
Okay. So you guys, you're familiar with the Sino-Soviet split.
Yes.
Yeah. Yep. Like, okay. So, China basically so the short version of this is, I think India forks democracy and eventually becomes a global, like, democratic leader.
Actually, one thing, sorry, Balaji, can you explain the Sino-Soviet split to listeners?
Okay, sure. All right. Let me rewind to that and then explain the whole thing. Okay. So, the Soviet Union, after the Russian Revolution in 1917, had something called the Comintern, the Communist International. And so it was the state that also had this international network of like communist spies that were trying to overthrow all these various governments. They were almost like venture communists that would go and try and find like young, ambitious, crazy people like a Pol Pot or a Mao, and exactly, right. And they would, kind of give them slogans and they'd give them arms and be like, say all this stuff, but in Vietnamese and Chinese, and you can flip your country, right? And they were like running these scouts. And then the thing is that this, it was almost like an evangelical who will go and hand out, Bibles off the back of a truck, right? This was someone, they'd hand out the Communist Manifesto. That's why like Marx is still on the billboards in China, like they have the four guys. So he's a prophet there. And, they'd flip the countries, and then these would all essentially fold into the Soviet Union, and they'd flip a country like Cuba in the name of making everybody equal, and then like vampires suck and drain the resources out of it and turn it into like a staging base for nuclear arms. So they deliver, poverty while promising great equality, but it was an amazing kind of like ideological expansion thing for this, this doctrine of communism. Okay, what's the point? So all of these other smaller communist countries were essentially folding in to Stalin. But Mao didn't want to be a lieutenant to Stalin forever, right? Didn't want to fold into the Soviet Union forever. He had his own ambitions. China has 1 billion people. And even though he was the junior partner for a while, eventually there was this thing called the Sino-Soviet split, where Maoism was articulated as the more agricultural and sort of psychotic version. And, Soviet communism was actually Marxist-Leninist, and it was actually in its more conservative phase. Like Maoism was still plowing through people with the Great Leap Forward and, the Cultural Revolution, when Soviet communism had entered its Khrushchev and Brezhnevian phase, right? So Maoism was still like, it was like more insane during that period, right?
Yeah.
And so that also shows, by the way, it's almost like, how like a pandemic can hit and it can spike infections here, and a lot of people can die and they can die off and so on. Like some of these things, like, the ideological movements can surge overseas after some time delay. It took like 30, 40 years after peak killing in Russia before the same thing happened in China. So there can be a time delay on some of this stuff. That's something to keep in mind. Anyway, point is that Sino-Soviet split meant that Mao articulated an ideology of Maoism that then gave China, as sort of a nation, this ideological split was also a split in terms of power, right? Because now Mao no longer reported to Stalin. He was a true CEO of his own, wing of the global communist movement, okay? And this actually, you can also think of Protestant versus Catholic in the 1500s is like this. When I was a kid, I was like, why do they care about the Eucharist and the body of Christ? Why would people like literally kill each other in religious wars over this stuff in the 1600s, and starting the 1500s, but going to the 1600s? And the answer is it was a power struggle. And that was just a symbol, is, the Holy Roman Empire, is the church going to be ruling, or is it going to be, your Protestant little, slice, your own kingdom? Can you declare independence or not? Decentralized or centralized? And the Eucharist was just like a symbol of that. And, similar to sort of like Shiite versus Sunni, like, the Persians have a way ideologically of sort of getting independence by articulating ideological difference. That's also a jurisdictional difference. It's a sovereignty difference, right? Okay. So bringing that back here, Maoism was a way for the Chinese to kind of have their own domain. They split, they forked, communism with Chinese characteristics, right? As opposed to taking everything slavishly, right? So they forked it, they forked the root, okay? And that actually is a technique the Chinese have applied many, many times in history. Like Buddhism is kind of like imported from India, but they forked it and they kind of customized it, right? If you look at a lot of the stuff they do today, a lot of the tech stuff, they have, they blocked all foreign social networks, but they forked them and they had them where they have a local root, right? Yep. So they forked the root, okay? And so they have versions of everything, but they all fold up to CCP as opposed to headquarters in Seattle or in San Francisco, right? So that's actually a pretty good technique, honestly, as a culture or civilization, is let them build it, see it, build your own version, but have a different root. So you're the system administrator of this kind of thing. Okay, what's the point? Point is, Chinese communism was the backwater version of communism for a few decades, okay? Maoism was like the crazier little, version of the Soviet communism. But when the Soviet version of communism face planted, right, when it was so ideological that over the 80s and then just suddenly burst into flames, right? Somehow Deng's version of communism was more pragmatic. It had taken on enough capitalism. It had leavened it with sort of the pragmatism of Deng Xiaoping, and it survived. And now it's actually, in a sense, the leading brand of communism in the world. Mm-hmm. Okay, if there's a hammer and sickle, it basically means Chinese communism. And it's this insane thing where this ideology, I think of it as a piece of software, right? But this ideology that was coded by Marx, in like Northern Europe, 170 years ago, the hammer and sickle is flying on the flag of a military ship in the South China Sea.
It's true. Yeah.
Right. When you think about like how far, like it's literally like, in the year 2281, you have Martians and they're waving a flag with Sagar's face on it. Like, right. That meme just traveled like so far. Right. And I'm not comparing you to Marx, of course, I'm complimenting you. I'm just saying, right? And so what am I getting at? That turned out that pragmatic version was in second place, but because the leading, Euro variety basically just kind of ideologically face planted, it eventually kind of came in first, right? And eventually what happened was communism has become whatever the CCP says it is, right? Why is that? Because Bo Xi is to the left of the Communist Party and Jack Ma is to the techno-libertarian right. And then Falun Gong is kind of over here and Hong Kong is to the democratic left. Basically, there's this great visual by Merrick's that shows the Chinese political spectrum, right? And it is a political spectrum. They don't all, it's a billion person country. They don't all think the same, obviously. Okay. Mm-hmm. So if you see that, you see that the circle is like kind of where the mainstream is, right? And then you have kind of the US sympathizing left libertarians in the top left, then you have kind of the capitalists who are just barely within the circle. This is when this came out, I think this came out in 2015. Now capitalists are like less in the circle nowadays. Even the industrialists who are less, financiers, but they're more builders, even they have kind of been getting hit because, they're shipping overseas, but like the party warriors and the flag wavers and like, all of those guys, the circle is kind of been moving towards them. Right. And the thing about this is you could do this for the US. And, one way of thinking about it is like, if communism is what, here's a one-liner. Okay. You guys will love this one. If communism is what the Chinese Communist Party says it is, then quote unquote democracy is what the American Democrat Party says it is. Okay. And why do I say that? Right. Mm-hmm. Because when there is censorship, when there is deplatforming, when there is, invasions, when there is NSA surveillance, when there's all these things that would normally be thought of as undemocratic, well, those are fine if they're quote protecting democracy. But if somebody who is disaligned with the American Democrat Party wins an election, well, that's an attack on democracy, right? So it's actually not a process, it's a party. Just like communism is not, a process of communism. It's whatever the Chinese Communist Party says it is at that time, because you could be too communist and you could be not communist enough. You could even be a capitalist and be in the Communist Party. You could be, folks who say pack the court or whatever, and that would be totally democracy. And when you see it in this way, it's literally, if it is coming from within this social network, it is communism. If it's coming within the social network, it's democracy. And if it's from the outside, it's not. Then a lot becomes clear. Because now you can easily predict whether something is democracy or not. It's democracy if it favors the interests of the American Democrat Party, and it is not if it does not. And then, of course, there's foreign governments, some of which you consider aligned with the American Democrat Party, and some of which you consider totally disaligned, and some which are wayward children and in the middle, like Macron, for example, in France, right? So when Macron criticizes, then he is, like an authoritarian, blah, blah, whatever, right? But it's also possible, by the way, just like Boji Lee, to be a left deviationist. For example, in the Venezuelans, right? You don't call them; they're not called socialists, but they are called authoritarian. They're called, Maduro is called a dictator because now he's such a left deviation that he's outside of the democracy, window, right? Now, just to put this in contrast, when Mark Zuckerberg is competing with WeChat, he doesn't say they're not practicing technology, right? So technology is actually a process that can be done by people. He's not saying that WeChat is not practicing proper computer science, right? So coding, computers, those are abstract processes that can be done by anybody. But communism is what the Chinese Communist Party says it is. Democracy is what the American Democrat Party says it is. But maybe it's not, right? Why? Because just like the Sino-Soviet split, something I think is coming may be the Indo-Anglo split on democracy. Okay. Why is that? Because India can potentially articulate a nonviolent version of democracy, right? It's not drone striking. It's not invading lots of countries. It got its independence nonviolently. It is, fundamentally something which has had, it's the world's largest democracy, whatever. And it has the mass of people. And it's also got actually a fairly large diaspora, and it can argue in English, right? China cannot argue in English. It's actually amazing if you look at the Chinese ambassador to the US, how terrible they are in making their case. Yeah. They're awful, right? Yeah. And you think, like, obviously there's Chinese people who are incredibly eloquent, but that system, the CCP, does not select for people who are good at arguing English. They're amazing at arguing in Chinese. Yep. Like their domestic messaging is I'm sure it's phenomenal, or at least it's certainly effective. But abroad, there's zero selection pressure for that, right? So whereas with India, I think India can make a case for, if it can just maintain stability, right? If it can be a democracy, but like not fall into civil war, right? If it can be a democracy and just sort of tamp down to some extent on like the level of insanity the US is getting to, if it has conflict but remains standing, sort of like how China, had conflict but remained standing, whereas the Soviet Union face planted. Well, guess what? Then democracy is not, quote, a process that's discredited. It's just that particular implementation that was.
A quick question here. I'm curious how India's largely like non-aligned foreign policy plays into this, because we could get into a whole separate debate about the war in Ukraine, which is a whole different episode, or how basically the Asia Pacific region responded to like Chinese aggression. But like very clearly, like South Korea, Japan, Vietnam in some contexts are clearly like turning to the US. The EU and Ukraine, especially turning to the US. India, for a variety of reasons, I did an episode with this, like is not going to play that role from like a democratic perspective. So how does their alignment when it comes to foreign policy play into basically the framework you're providing?
Great question. So the thing is that so actually Jayakumar, who's the Indian foreign minister, like I think the equivalent of the Secretary of State. Yep. Okay. So he actually had a good quote on this, which he's like, look, India represents 1 billion people. I think it's entitled to have its own side. It doesn't have to be picking sides with the US or China, with the West or China. The West is about 1 billion people. If you take the US and the EU and Japan, basically all the places that, one way of thinking about it, by the way, is, and here's kind of I think I mentioned this before, but if I have not, can you name a country that is regarded as a, quote, democracy that was not a US or UK colony or does not have a US or UK military base?
I don't know. I'm sure there's basic Argentina.
That's pretty right. So like Uruguay, you could probably get to because, to my knowledge wasn't, but you have to actually search, right? Most of them, democracy is actually like has a US military base or is a reliable US military ally, right? Not a democracy is not a US military ally. which is a different perspective on it, right? Because it also usually means, if you trace it back enough, that democracy was imposed by colonization or invasion at some point, right? Like obviously Germany and Japan were forcibly democratized, right? They were not adopting it of their...
quick.
And obviously denazification. Go ahead.
Whoa, just a quick fact check on that one.
Yeah.
I hate to be fact checked. I mean, Japan was a democracy in the 20s and 30s, and like Germany, like was no, they were like literally, like that's literally true. And the Germans were, like the Germans had like a parliamentary system, like even before like the monarchy fell in World War I. So all I just mean is that those two examples, those two examples are interesting because, like, in a way, that's actually a repudiation of democracy at gunpoint, because both actually had democratic traditions that just didn't just emerge inorganically. Is all I mean.
Totally. So actually, it's a good point, and let me kind of explain. Let me clarify what I mean. In the post-war era, democracy means U.S. military ally. Of course, before the U.S. even existed, democracy meant something else. But think about, let's take the word focus away from democracy for a second. Think about, let's say, Christianity, right? Mm-hmm. This is a word that's so big that it can encompass, like, cathedrals, and it can encompass the Spanish Inquisition, right? it can encompass like the conservative Christian in America, or the liberation theologist of like Latin America, who's like actually like a Marxist, right? It can encompass the revolutionary ideology that tore down the Roman Empire, or the ruling class ideology that built the Holy Roman Empire, right? So it's a capacious thing because it contains in many ways like some statement and its opposite. And, you can find bits and pieces of this library to kind of say what you want, right? Capitalism is also like that. What is capitalism? People, the agrarian capitalism of the 1800s, the industrial capitalism of the 1900s, and the information capitalism of the 2000s. Are there some similarities? I'm sure there's laws where you can point all the way through, but man, the structure of the economy, if we were to analyze it, like is very different, right? And so democracy is kind of like that. And to be clear, your point is a good one. What I'm talking about is in the current era, democracy is currently synonymous with rule by the US establishment, more broadly. Because, and by the way, when I say the American Democrat Party, that's a rhetorical, because there's some folks like, let's say, the neoconservatives who are based, even if they're nominally Republicans, they're aligned with the American Democrat Party. There's others like Glenn Greenwald who are Democrats, but are not aligned with the US establishment, right? So really a better term is the US establishment, okay? But the interesting thing is, one of my points is that the way that democracy is saved may be like a from left field thing that nobody's actually thinking about. The way democracy is saved is India maintains like some degree of stability on the other side of the world. It's kind of, that is to say, like, it's not that, oh, we have to go and fight the Chinese and blow up for democracy and surveil people and censor them and deplatform them and, use all this force. Like, it's a totally Z-axis way of thinking about it that actually the current implementation is failing. But when a company fails, you don't say capitalism has failed, right? Some people do. Enron fails, you say capitalism has failed. No, the process didn't fail. That particular implementation did, right? And, there's many different, like when you talk to a CEO, the theory and the practice are not the same. Sometimes the practice will be better than the theory. Sometimes it's way worse. So this particular implementation may not make it, or it may have made it in the past and is on its last legs, but it won't disappear from this earth. So it's a most unusual pro-democracy case, perhaps, that you've heard, all right? Which is the implementation. There's another, it's like, foundation.
Yeah.
Concept, right?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It's like there's another thing on the other side of the world where, like the thing might be kept alive, right? Mm-hmm. And so this also relates to the thing versus China. Like, I simply, one of the points I make in the book is, in some ways, the US versus China is like a flip of the US versus the USSR. Okay. Why? Because the US versus the USSR, the US was very much on the economic right and the USSR was on the economic left. With the US versus China, today's US is on the cultural left and China's on the cultural right. Okay. Mm-hmm. And do you agree with that? Obviously,
no,
100%.
Yeah. Could you in 15 seconds explain to listeners what you mean by cultural right in China?
Yes. So China is for the Han, right? It is basically, it's for the Chinese majority. It's like ethno-nationalist, right? Mm-hmm. And I'd say America is ethno-masochist, right? Like, let's say white people to the back of the line for vaccines. Okay, like the reason I was pointing to that, it's an official government policy that says based on your race, you get deprioritized. Okay, and that like because there's lots of things that are in the air on this. There's 1,000 individual examples. That's a very cut and dried thing. It's an official policy that says back of the line, right? So that's an ethno-masochist state and it's moving in that direction, whereas China is an ethno-nationalist state that's privileging the Han. And now in the middle of this, so like essentially their fundamental premises is being for the majority race the ultimate good, that's China, or is it the ultimate bad? That's, you know, today's America. But could you have a different freaking axis? And for me, that's the pseudonymous economy. That's actually what I want to signal on, or what I think we should build, is something where you cannot discriminate for or against somebody on the basis of their race. You can't cancel them either. And you're also not naive about it. You're not saying, hey, can't we all just get along? Instead, you take away the information that would be used for that cancellation or discrimination. It takes all of the left's concepts of blind auditions, ban the box, you know, and like not asking about somebody's marital status or immigration status during hiring. It takes all those things and it marries them to, you know, Satoshi's pseudonymity and to, you know, the you know, ideals of meritocracy and so on, and puts them in a package that actually can be delivered on by technology, which is pseudonymity, you know, and so it's AI, it's like AI voice filters and so on. When we do a Zoom by 2035 or 2030 or sooner, it'll all be, this is a transitional mode. You will be whoever you want to be in the open metaverse. Mm-hmm. And that actually is, you know, it's one of those things where I think it's the right thing because it takes certain left ideals of equality, everybody on the planet with an internet connection, you cannot discriminate against someone on the basis of their accent, on the basis of their upbringing or anything like that. They speak fluently in the language, but it's also total economic opportunity. You have the largest possible market, right? So that's actually where I think on the other side of the rainbow, we want to actually aim for, away from this sort of racialized kind of unfortunate thing that this, you know, China versus US axis is putting us into.
Quick,
and so that's why, like, anyway, go ahead. Reject the binary.
Sorry,
let me put it like that.
I'll STF you after this one, but Balaji, I love that you brought up the global marketplace bit. I'm interested in backlash, right? In ways that, for example, when you talk about this global marketplace, that actually, if you're an American, is kind of shitty. And you know what I mean? Like, if you are a status quo American, what you are really saying is everyone is now competing for jobs across every single segment. So it's easy for us to say, so let's think about it this way, right? Like think of like the story of the last 30 years of globalization, like Ohio rotted, the Rust Belt had all these problems, opioid crisis, on and on and on and on. Another way to say that is China raised 500 million people out of poverty because they had economic opportunity. So can you just talk about what the backlash from the American middle class would be to the world you're describing? Because like another way of you saying, you know, pseudonymity is like not preferencing like national boundary and even just like citizenship when it comes to employment and these different bits. Like, how do you think that operationalizes itself?
Well, okay. So there's a lot I can say on this. So first, let me talk about the morality, and then let me talk about how I think it might play out. Okay. So on the morality of it, this is a complicated matter because, you know, the 1950s are idealized in America and in different ways. You know, it's like maybe it's like fading or whatever now, but even Krugman or whatever on the left likes it because it was a time when tax rates were 90% and everybody was equal and the government was really powerful and so on and so forth. But the right likes it because how, you know, you could have a guy who just worked, he had a high school diploma and he could work at a factory and support a family and have a house and so on. And now all those times gone away. Okay. But during that period, the rest of the world was bombed out, atomically bombed. They were under communism, they were under socialism. Basically, they were just like in ruins or economically ruined, right? The entire Eurasian continent was like just flaming wreckage, basically, or slaves, you know, in the gulag. And that meant that that US worker, relatively speaking, had the least competition for anything. You know, they had the wind at their back in this huge way, you know, and, you know, I'm not a zero sum person at all. I actually do believe that everybody can succeed together. However, it is true that that's why you had a guy who had a high school degree in the US who had such high earning power. But you had somebody who would have been like amazing at physics or graphic design or something like in the rice fields of, you know, China or India and never achieved that opportunity or died, you know, very young, right? And if you're a humanist and an internationalist, I mean, this is actually the gap between there's the nationalist and the socialist, and the capitalist and the internationalist. And the political compass, right?
Yeah.
Like left auth, right auth, left lib, right? And the question of internationalism is actually which cuts the spectrum in half, and it's actually top bottom as opposed to right left. Okay, because the right libertarian and left libertarian, for different but overlapping reasons, do believe in an internet where a peer-to-peer thing where you interact with somebody across the border equally, whether it's for an economic transaction or you can marry them, work with them, speak with them, et cetera. And the left libertarian has like an instinctive revulsion to nationalism, and the right libertarian has an instinctive revulsion to socialism. But both socialism and nationalism presume the state; they presume a particular region.
Yes.
And the socialists and nationalists, they'll say, look, you can't be, look, you have to have some degree of particularism, because what are you going to favor some random person on the other side of the world over your own mother or next door neighbor, right? And that has a coherence as well, right? And and then the counter argument on the other side is, well, am I going to give that next door neighbor, this incredibly important job over the guy who's the most qualified in the world? Like, why would I want to wreck my company doing that? Why don't you go and wreck your own company, right? So that is actually like a cleavage. And you can, of course, make, I think, consistent arguments on this on both sides. And then you just sort of have to see how it nets out, right? And what I mean by that is, in different ages, under different technological conditions, the same philosophy will work or not work. Okay. So it's not that the words have some immortality to them. It's like in an age where you have, the internet and AI and all this other stuff, things might work that don't. For example, I have one little short story in there as an alternate ending called China Could Make a Pencil. This is a theoretical story. Okay. I'm not saying it's real. Okay.
Is this the iPencil reference?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So here's a concept, right? So, iPencil is a reference to the concept that if you hold up a pencil, if I had one here, I'd hold it up. It actually is very different. Like, no one person can make a pencil. Why? Because it's got like the yellow lacquer on it. It's, the paint. It's got the little metal that holds the rubber. It's got the wood. It's got the graphite. It's got the machine tool that carves. Like, all of those things, when you build out the supply chain for them, the rubber is coming from some forest somewhere. The aluminum is from some mine. The wood from another forest. The mines from yet another forest. Oh, also you need the generator for the power for the machine. Like, it's like millions of people that go into that supply chain for that pencil, right? And so the argument that got a lot of traction in the second half of the 20th century was socialism and communism wasn't just immoral, it was inefficient. Okay. And the thing is that in the early 20th century, people thought it was both moral and efficient. You know why?
No.
They thought it was moral because everyone was equal. They thought it was efficient because they'd get rid of this dog-eat-dog competition. Right? This, why do we need to all compete, guys? Why can't we just cooperate? And rather than like a bunch of people making different brands of the same milk, why can't we all have one collective farm? So people feared that the communist model would get better economies of scale and prove more efficient. And they supported capitalism on ethical grounds and thought communism might outproduce it on pure industrial grounds at that time, right? Now, it turned out that was not the case, okay, because the Soviet model, they didn't have the price signals and, all the stuff that Hayek and iPencil talk about. But there are new things under the sun. And it is possible, and I actually can give you some data points on this, it is possible that China and its digital yuan system actually has the information to make a pencil. And let me explain why I say that. So are you familiar, do you know what a two-sided marketplace is?
It's been a while, but I'm pretty sure. Why don't you go ahead and explain it?
Okay. So like Uber, Airbnb,
yes.
eBay, right? Yeah. Okay. So these are things, and actually Google, Facebook are like this as well. Why? So Facebook has users and it has advertisers, right? Google has searchers and advertisers. Uber has riders and drivers. Okay. So this constitutes a two-sided marketplace. I've been an investor in them. I have Coinbase is also a two-sided marketplace. You've got buyer and seller, right? So I've built, invested, I've seen these things at scale over the last 15 or 20 years and done fairly well on them. Okay, fine. So I've coded them. I have some experience. All right. There's folks who know more, but I'm just saying this comes from experience, what I'm about to say. So the thing about two-sided marketplaces is you're running a marketplace of tens of millions, sometimes hundreds of millions of people. And a lot of the stupid ideological things that people say, if you try applying them, you'll lose. Okay. So first of all, if you try the ideological left things where you try to take away price signals and hope everybody's going to be fair and equal and gift economy. And so like that basically doesn't scale. That's why, Airbnb beat couch surfing, because there was a tracking of how valuable this person's place was, that person, like couch surfing and just staying on somebody's couch versus like actually having a payment scales in a way that doesn't. Okay. But interestingly, some of the right libertarian Hayekian stuff, the iPencil stuff also didn't work. Okay. So you know what Sidecar is? So
yes, I remember Sidecar.
Okay. Well, yeah, I remember that
okay.
name. Yeah.
So early Uber competitor. Okay. In fact, I think it predated Uber. And the thing is a decent company, but they had the wrong model. And what was their model is you opened the app and you got to see what car you'd pick, and every driver could set their own price, and then you could kind of bid with them. Now, if you came into this from a Hayekian standpoint, you'd say those drivers should be able to set their own price. They have local information. They know their own gas costs and so on. The riders should want to compute it and so on and so forth. And a central planner would not be able to do better than this decentralized market making process. Turned out to not be the case. The reason is that Uber actually did have the information, unlike the Soviet Union, because it had it in a database. It could generate a real-time histogram of prices. It could give a recommended price to both driver and rider at the same time. And it knew more than all of them put together. The whole was greater than the sum of the parts. And it fundamentally, at the most abstract level, Uber outcompeted Sidecar and anybody who tried bidding on prices, partly because people just didn't value $3 off or riding in a Ford over a Chrysler as much as they did over the speed and so on, right? So there's something else that they were bidding on. So at the very meta level, it's true that the market still works, but at the detail level, it's not true that it's decentralization all the way down. Decentralization is a tool, centralization is a tool. And literally at the level of being a manager of a multi-10 million person marketplace, right? Which, by the way, has a volume that's in excess of the GDP of many countries, okay? You see that the Hayekian model does not always work. And so that experience has led me to think that it's possible that the level of analytics that China gets with its digital yuan, where it sees everything, right? Like that whole set of parts that we were talking about with like the pencil, like it could literally see and do a backtrace that pulls everything. Okay, all the way back to the rubber farm in Africa, all the way back to every single person in it. Like these databases we're talking about, Facebook is 3 billion people, like, Chinese police database was already leaked. These do exist. These things that were so large as to be impractical are now tangible and computable, and multiple people have experience with them. Multiple people have decades of experience with them. So this gets back to my point about the words. The same concept may be feasible in a given age and infeasible in another age. And so central planning and coordination may actually be a much, much bigger deal in this century than we realize because of the power of what AI actually is, right? Now, yes. I've got counter arguments against this. As I said in this essay, I don't like this conclusion because I don't want to give up my freedom. And I feel like the libertarian-ish of the early 20th century who was actually concerned about communism because it hadn't yet been proven that it was going to be so inefficient, right? People thought that there's a possibility that it had better economies of scale through pure coercion. It didn't turn out that way, but people thought that. There's a book called Red Plenty on this, which talks about like, okay, maybe after you break all those eggs, you do get an omelet at the end, you get the coordination benefits from scale. Didn't turn out that way, doesn't mean there might not be something else that comes with that. All right, let me pause there. That was a big download.
No, I think that's important. And actually, if you do have a biggest fear of the Chinese model, that is probably what it ultimately comes down to, especially if you understand just how not invasive necessarily, but all encompassing that their database and app usage are. Like people talk here about WeChat, Alibaba, and like what that actually means in practice whenever you have that combined with social credit and more. It's kind of the nightmare scenario, but definitely possible. Go ahead.
It is the all-seeing, all-knowing God.
Yeah.
I mean, like in the sense of,
I don't think there's another way to describe it. Yeah.
Right. Like Santa knows if you're naughty or nice, like that kind of thing that, the database they've got in WeChat and what it is knows more about you than you know about yourself. Okay. It's like, it could probably make a model of you and interrogate it and ask it questions in a sense. Right. So we just don't know what that is yet. Like, I mean, obviously the possibility of exploiting that and using that for evil is obvious and will happen. It's like Chekhov's gun, thing, right? Like the gun on the mantelpiece, it will go off. It has gone off. Unfortunately, you see the potential for abuse. One point I make in the book though, is that like, people, when you say that, you're like, oh yeah, that's why we have to fight China because obviously they're like so evil and so on and so forth. And it's like, I would definitely agree that the surveillance state they built is terrifying and so on. But there's an important point, which is unfortunately that the way to think about how the U.S. establishment acts is not more ethical. It's just less competent. Okay. Do you know why I say that?
Well, I mean, I'll push on the competent bit, but it's also restrained in a way that it isn't, right? So like,
I think it's just not capable. Is that a better word?
Well, but
it's not capable, not competent.
Yeah, because like, for example, like remove the Supreme Court, remove the filibuster, remove the 60-seat threshold. President Pete Buttigieg can do all sorts of things, right? So I'll just push on that part, but please.
Okay. So here's my paragraph, and then shoot at this paragraph, right? Okay. It's really crucial to understand that the U.S. establishment is not more ethical than the CCP when it comes to civil liberties. It's just less competent. After all, the U.S. establishment also does warrantless surveillance via the NSA, unconstitutional search and seizure via the TSA, arbitrary confiscation of property via civil forfeiture, and so on and so forth. And that's just all what's a tiny subset of what's being rolled out. They also want to do disinformation agencies, civilian disarmament, digital censorship, and I could go down the list. A lot of those things have been rolled out. And the fortunate thing is that in the US, the person who's doing like the disinformation agency is like this, kind of like joke character, from right, the one who is doing the Christmas carols, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. So like we're fortunate that it's the clownish TSA, the clownish lockdowns, that it's like an NSA that gets hacked by Snowden. And, they're a weird combination of the Stasi and the Keystone Cops.
So here's where this is where it gets really interesting. And this is the big debate, right? What I disagree with the paragraph is just the moral equivalency. In the sense that, so warrantless surveillance, for example, like that is a off the cuff 2002 response to 9/11, a world of 15 years ago, a world where basically everyone in our society agreed that we should respond to this issue that way. That is not the same thing as the CCP
social credit score
unilaterally deciding this is how we're going to do this or that. Yeah. Right. Let me put it this way. We have evidence that the Chinese establishment will conduct a red famine and run people over with tanks at Tiananmen Square. There is literally zero evidence that the disinformation board puts people in FEMA camps. That's basically the way that I'd put it. Okay. And to be fair though, and this is where we could get like kind of woke. 1890s American establishment put Native American people in camps, and FDR put people in the job. So I'm talking modern wise, right? I'm talking. Totally. So to your point about how like let's put democracy pre-45 aside, let's put the U.S. like center left. I went to Harvard. Pete Buttigieg. Let's judge them by today's standard. Pete Buttigieg is not executing people the way the Chinese are. That's what I put forward.
Okay. So here, let me actually postulate a difference between restraint and constraint. Okay. So restraint is like self-restraint, and constraint is you can't do it because there's some external force constraining you. Okay. And one of the kind of points I make is that I will absolutely agree with you that domestically, the US establishment is more constrained than the Chinese establishment, right? Like if you're in China and you cross the CCP, you can, end up in a Uyghur-like camp. You can maybe have, there's reports, more credible reports. Your organs harvested. I thought that was like a urban myth, but there's a thing in tablets.
Oh yeah, it's real.
Yeah, so I thought it was a myth. It might be real. Okay, like they have no domestic opposition, right? So in the U.S., I think there's a lot of people who would go and do nasty things to the other side. But there is domestic political opposition. And the reason I say that is look at the shootings, look at the guy who went and shot up the, obviously just yesterday or whatever, 2 days ago.
Yeah, the parade.
Right. But the baseball game, the Congress, the Bernie bro went and shot the baseball.
That's right.
Like there's a bunch of crazy people in the US, that's a disorganized violence, but there's also, we saw BLM, we saw a lot of crazy things, right? So there's a bunch of folks who, if they did have entire control of the government, would do bad things to the other side. But there's political opposition in the US that constrains people from doing that, in my view. However, abroad, unfortunately, it's reversed. Abroad, China is the more restrained because China isn't blowing things up around the world. It is because the US military constrains it. It's not like good because it's inherently good. It's good because it's weaker. I'm going to say good. The folks it behaves itself and is not bombing Africa. It's building up Africa, but the US is bombing the Middle East. That is not to say that China would not be much more nasty. Certainly the folks in its backyard in Southeast Asia are very concerned about, what an unleashed dragon would look like, right? But it is something that abroad, the US has, unfortunately, half a dozen countries are basically in ruins and anarchy because of, whether you call it right or left wing ideology, whether you call it the neocons or Samantha Power's R2P, like responsibility to protect, who talks about our, like Libya, Tunisia, Iraq, Syria, like these countries are in ruins, right? They were functional countries before and they weren't great, but it's like literally millions of people dead and displaced, huge refugee crisis. There has to be some ethical, I'm not saying this as like a, oh, I hate America kind of thing. But I'm like, abroad, the US actually has killed, unfortunately, a lot of people for no reason.
I'm curious. This is the biggest pushback that and by the way, I actually agreed with a lot of the Chinese competence argument until COVID zero. And I was like, wow,
sure.
That actually blows a real hole in a lot. Because look, to be honest with you, I was like, look, these people are smart. I was like, they're way smarter than we are. I was like, look at the way that they, engineer their TikTok algorithms to encourage the best things. And yeah, I think there's, deep evil to a lot of what they do with Han supremacy. But at the end of the day,
this is actually
they're good managers, go ahead. Yeah. And then I saw COVID zero and I was like, oh, they actually are as dumb as some, like sometimes Marxists do weird Marxist shit.
Yes.
And I was like, that's pretty much what this is. Anyway, go ahead.
This is a very good point. Okay, let's talk about that. So, one thing that I don't think is that obvious because we're not immersed in the Chinese ecosystem, but Xiification, like Xi Jinping's like transformation of Chinese culture, is as big a deal as wokeification.
Yeah,
but in the opposite direction, and it started around the same time.
Okay, do you mean by opposite direction? Do you mean like left-right spectrum or?
Yes, cultural left-right.
Okay,
like. Basically, in 2012, the US and China were much closer to each other in the sense of being internationalist, capitalist.
Right. Yeah, like Hu Jintao and Bush were not that far apart.
Or Hu Jintao and Obama, exactly right. They were really not that far apart. They were basically, like China wasn't that. China was basically there to do business. It was hide your time, bide your peace, or whatever. Bide your time and hide your strength, or something like that. Okay, but what happened, so we know what happened with wokeification, right? And that was an exponential that built over the 2010s. And we saw just to put it in graphs, right? Because sometimes it's useful to take a trend and put it in graphs. Have you seen the Paul Graham tweet on this?
Is it the use of terms going up?
Yes, it's the use of terms, right? So put that on screen, okay? And now I will show a graph that you probably have not seen. So you basically, the thing about this was showing is like New York Times word usage frequency.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So New York Times, essentially their stock was down in the early 2010s. And then they found that woke words got a lot of traffic. And then they started lacing all their articles with this like sugar. That's a major component of what happened. I think it's under discussed. Okay. And, they found that this kind of conflict is attention. And, hey, they could also say that they were doing it for moral cause and people either fooled themselves or now the numbers are up. Boom. Right. And the thing is that the other kind of version of this, I want to find this mentions of Xi Jinping in Chinese stock filings. Okay.
Interesting.
So basically, the Chinese SEC, nobody used to ever have to mention Xi in, here we go. So Adam 2 is nearly 400 of the 3,900 companies listed on stock exchanges in mainland China paid homage to the Communist Party and Xi Jinping in their annual reports this year. Huge increase since 2017.
Wow.
Okay. So something's going on there, right? They have also gone into this like crazy ultra nationalist signaling thing, right? And the reason I pointed this graph is sometimes you can get your hands around like undeniable, like every single, like that's an annual report, right? So it's a pretty audited piece of thing. If you want to reproduce that graph, you can do so. You can see the change. Clearly there's a symbolism to the change. I mean, there's 1,000 other things in Chinese society, but we can get our head around these hard numbers. Otherwise people are just talking about something that's in the air, right? So, and then the before and after of like some company didn't have to mention, woke stuff. And now it does. You could probably see something very similar for American company reports, where it's not talking about the dear leader, right? But it's talking about not the political leader, but the political ideology. Mm-hmm. Okay, so they say you can denounce a politician in the U.S., but you can't denounce the political ideology behind it. The politician is sort of dispensable. It's a decentralized ideology that's behind it. You cannot denounce that in your annual report. Maybe to a greater extent today, but certainly not even a couple of years ago. Okay, so what's my point? Basically, you're right, Sagar, that China has moved ideologically in a stupid way. Like stupid, just not in the sense of stupid in the sense of like not forward thinking. Right? Stupid in the sense of more bellicose, more nationalistic, more militaristic. That's one take on it. And I'd say I agree with it about 70%, 75%. Let me give the unfortunate possible 25% counter argument. There was another video that went viral in China, which I'll see if I can find, which was basically this guy, let me see if I can find this, who was packing somebody into a like a COVID zero, like confinement center or something like that. And what he was saying in Chinese was, we need to do this because we will eventually be at war with America. So you all need to get in line and think of this as like a fire drill, right? I'm like paraphrasing. Wow. And I'm not sure I can find this video, but it was like this thing that was pretty viral, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So the thing about that is like, again, I'd say I'd probably call it 75-25 or 80-20 in terms of 80%. I think it's stupid, but I just want to discount it. And the reason I want to discount it is I thought that the Chinese government was really stupid in the 2000s and early 2010s when they were blocking social media.
But it turned out to be the most correct move ever from their.
Imagine if. Yeah, exactly. From their perspective, basically, like Trump got, dropped through a trap door or whatever, right? And I mean, can you imagine some guy on Sina Weibo deplatforming Xi Jinping?
Yeah,
like, right. Like his relatives' fingernails would be put. Some crazy shit would happen for sure, right? Not to say that it's good. It's just something where, from their perspective, in terms of maintaining a lock on power, CCP was smart enough to see ahead and realize that even, the executives, by the way, who came there at that time genuinely believed in freedom of speech, right? That's, that was when Twitter and so on, there was the free speech wing and the free speech party. So, but CCP basically had seen the Arab Spring and other stuff, and they just wanted to fork the root. No matter what it was, they just wanted to maintain control. That's also what they also want to do with IP. It's like, yeah, you could operate in China, but then you have to like transfer IP. They want to fork the root at some point because they actually value that highly. Okay.
Quick thing.
So 20% is that they're like, it's like almost like bomb drills or something. Go ahead.
And a quick thing, the way you articulated this gets at the tension of the CCP, though, because like you're saying, good for their interests when it came to blocking social media. The CCP's claim is that it, in its own way, in a Chinese democracy sense, like represents, once again, the word democracy, like you said, could be stretched different ways. The Chinese Communist Party's central claim is that it is actually the receptacle and steward of like Chinese interests. From like the lowliest farmer to a tech executive in, Hong Kong. So it could be that blocking social media, reducing openness, preventing debate and discussion openly is good for the CCP's hold on power. The mid to long term, or maybe even short term test that could that could wreck this entire 21st century for the Chinese is the idea that this was good for the CCP, not good for China. So there could be a world where a world where there is more open social media, maybe that leads to a different party taking power, but it could be a world where we say, hey, like, if we're Chinese, hey, let's not like risk pissing off Trump and then turning the entire United States bipartisan establishment against China, which is what happened. Hey, maybe. So I'm not saying like, maybe let's have like an open debate about whether or not we go for Taiwan. Like, because like right now, a lot of the Taiwan, whenever people tell the Taiwan calculus, it's like, well, look, like Xi Jinping like really wants to cement his legacy, and that's why he's like pushing and being aggressive on that. So it's just kind of, so there's just two dynamics. So I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying. Yeah. There's just two different dynamics within there.
Totally. So, okay, there's a lot of different things. Let me put out one concept, which is also in the book on, it will come out as another alternate ending, which is a third model for like Chinese reform, right? And so insofar as I make a contribution, I try to like look for a V3 or a V4 to at least put it out there as something for discussion, right? Like rather than be anti-democracy or pro-democracy, be like, democracy is a process. Here's another implementation. It will survive. We don't have to identify it as equivalent to America because it was not equivalent to America over all time. And it does not have to be for all time. And so therefore it's not the same thing, right? One can survive without the other, right? In the same way, on the China thing, usually the way it's portrayed is either it is CCP will remain in control. This is their domestic narrative is after centuries of humiliation and imperialism. By the way, like the U.S. was one of the 8 Nations Alliance. Do you know what that was?
Yeah, of course. So the Boxer Rebellion and Herbert Hoover and lots of fun 1901 stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So the thing is, like, this stuff features like much more heavily in their domestic content, and it's like, oh, the Americans and the British, had us at gunpoint. They literally fought wars to addict us to heroin and opium. They now, in the name of democracy, just like the name of Christianity, they want to bring us back under subjugation. F them, right? Like after enormous blood and sweat, like the Chinese government or the Chinese people are standing up and take a look at your numbers. Yeah, we were in, rice farms 30 years ago, 40 years ago, but we're now like tied for number one on many measures or number 2 in other measures. So net, we've done a great job for you. Quote, reelect us, right? Like basically mandate of heaven. And, by the way, one thing that's funny about this, it took me a long time, but then I was able to put it like, do you know how communists, both the Soviets and the Chinese and so on, do you know how they justify like not having elections?
No.
It goes something like this. It's like, well, as obviously communism is for the people. And because we represent the people, anybody who'd want an election, what would they want? They want to bring the capitalists back, huh? And so they're enemies of the people.
Tight logic. I mean, that's what happens.
It's tight logic, right? So obviously, like the people have already won the election, comrade. The communists are power, right? So they actually like that little, self-justifying loop. Even the term, by the way, enemies of the people, aren't those enemies also people?
Yeah.
Right. Like, there is an in-group, out-group boundary, which is identified implicitly in the language, right? The implication is it's a tiny person who's an enemy. But what if that's like an entire people that's an enemy of the people, like Stalin deporting an entire ethnicity to Siberia or whatever, right? Okay. So anyway, so V1 is their internal justification narrative. And one thing that I think is very underappreciated by like guys like, Roger Garside has this book, China Coup and whatnot, right? Do you know this book?
No.
No. So it's worth looking at because I think I actually commented on it a bit in the book. I think of it. So the premise is a coup is going to happen in China and they're going to try to force out Xi Jinping and, all these folks there are going to be so, they're so scared that they've pissed off the US and they're going to bend and every tongue will confess democracy and, so on and so forth. And it's basically this interesting book because on the one hand, he's very conversant with, people and places within China. He understands China is not a monolith, but he treats the US as if it's like this sort of time warped thing from like the 80s where it's all everybody standing together, Western civilization and so on. And he's British and he's like of a certain, a man of a certain age. So he might just have like kind of a time warp version of what the US actually is nowadays in terms of its internal divisions. But I think the problem is it's like, he's like a he's a missing link between like the Christian evangelist and the Democratic evangelist. And you can see it in the writing there, where one of the things he writes a lot about is like CCP, cracking down on Christians, where he really thinks that like the Chinese nationalism is just like one guy, like Xi, and in this coup, then he'll overthrow, and everybody actually wants democracy and they're scared of the US and so on. That's not the case at all, actually, anymore. They don't respect the US as at the country level. Like, a lot of the woke propaganda and so on about institutional racism, systemic racism, BLM, all that travels overseas in a very different way than it does at home, right? When the woke says America's institutionally racist and so on, they mean it as a verbal weapon against the Southerner, okay? But on the global stage, it's like, wait a second, if America is systemically racist and institutionally racist, how can it also be like the leader of the world? Take away its power, right? You can't have those two things together. You can't say it's systemically racist, institutionally racist, and then want all the military bases and the nukes and so on. Why should all these non-white countries have the systemically racist power there? That's like having the KKK in your backyard, right? So the wokes use a certain set of words to gain power and then want to use different words to maintain it. But so overseas, that has been translated into Chinese. And so they've built up these local fortifications against that. Okay. So that's V1, that's their internal narrative. Then the V2, the outside is, of course, they built this giant surveillance state. They're oppressing their people. We need to help them. We need to build like Signal and all these tools and so on. And to be clear, I'm very sympathetic to that narrative. Okay. Fundamentally, do I want to be, I'm probably on some like impossible to get into, like I not that I'm one against China or have any things there, but I'm not going to try. Let me put it like that. Right. So I'm very sympathetic to, those folks. But the thing is, I think you have to do the V3. And what is the V3? It is not trying to reform at gunpoint. We've already seen like how many different countries has the US managed to push into anarchy? Like what is the track record over the last 20 years? The military confrontation has not worked, does not work. It just causes like things to blow up into flames and just constant anarchy and things blowing up, right? That tool is a bad tool. It just heightens tensions, causes people to die, breaks things, results in anarchy, not democracy. So what is a V3? The V3, in my view, is lots of Chinese people actually want to leave. Okay. There's something called Runzu. Have you heard of this?
No.
Okay. So in China, there's kind of like three things. It's like rat race, lie flat, Runzu. Okay. So rat race is, it's like more poetic in Chinese, rat race is you're keeping up with the Joneses, boom. Lie flat is what it sounds like. Oh man, I'm checked out. I'm just on the like couch playing video games. And Runzu is run philosophy, which means GTFO of China. Right? Mm-hmm. Get to America, get to Australia, get to this, get to that, et cetera. Now, I think they're going to have a grass is greener on the other side phenomenon in some ways where they'll find, actually they land in a country and, there's actually going to be, I think, a wave, unfortunately, of anti-Chinese sentiment that is building in some ways, like they're under suspicion because they're Chinese nationals. And so that I think is unfortunately going to build and they're going to be caught in the middle of that. And so the reason for that is like all previous places in academia where Chinese nationals used to land, it's like there's more and more suspicion, like it's difficult to be a Chinese national who is against the Chinese government because neither government is kind of trusting that person, unfortunately for them, right? Less so today, or rather, I say more so today, less trust, right? So what to do, how to help that person? And I think the answer is help them fund them to build startup society. So there are Chinatowns around the world, right? Mm-hmm. There is obviously Hong Kong, there's Taiwan. What if you take those Chinatowns and build free Chinese cities? Okay. So they're populated by a lot of people want to leave China now. A lot of people want to leave. Millions of people want to leave Hong Kong. This is a whole movement because unlike American anarchy, where everybody I think is just going to fight and slug it out with their, like their First Amendment and their Second Amendment, their free speech and automatic weapons, or, I know it's not automatic. Okay, some gun guy will correct me. Or like,
oh, trust me, every time in the YouTube comments.
I'm not a gun guy. Okay. I'm not, whatever. I don't even
That's
want to
surprising.
Get on
Given the valence of your politics should make you a gun guy. But anyway, yeah.
So that's, but I'm idiosyncratic. Right? So here's on the gun topic for what it's worth. I totally understand why the Second Amendment exists. I understand all that logic. However, what I prefer is Singapore. Why? Because I don't want to shoot somebody. That's like the ultimate, like last resort, right? Sure. Like, it's like this thing where there'll be this massive drama around it. And, everybody will be second guessing everything that somebody does in the heat of them. What you want is a state that you can trust to do the security for you, that will do it in a scaled way, that will basically just take care of the streets, and you don't have to shoot anybody, right? That's what you actually want. And then that social contract entering a country like that, it's fine to not have guns, right? Like basically, have you heard the term the behavioral immune system?
No.
So the behavioral immune system, it's like, hey, you see this like spoiled milk? Well, your cognition in your brain keeps you away from drinking that spoiled milk.
Like it smells bad. You're like, no.
It smells, so you don't even drink it, right?
Yeah.
If you actually drink it, then the cells in your body, it's the last line of defense. They have to like just go and fight. Start not right. And so, why would you, if you're smart, why would you want to bring it to that level where your cells have to actually fight it off? You want to be able to fight it off with intellect well before it actually hits the body, And, anyway, so on the gun topic, whatever, that's obviously people lose their minds about it. But I mean, there's another way of, anyway, I'm not a gun expert.
I got some guys who have to work on my house, so I have to get out of here in a little bit. But my last question here is just about the realignment. You were talking to us before. You have the realignment in the book. So give us the case there in the network state, what the realignment means, and just bring it full circle for our people.
Sure. So here is, again, this is a scenario. I'm not saying it's 100%, call it sci-fi. Okay. As I said, the book is kind of structured as problem and solution. Problem is state of the world. Solution is startup societies and network states. Mm-hmm. And you can take or reject some or all of it. Even if you're like a Peter Zihanist, right? Who disagrees strongly with probably 70% of what I'd said, but actually would agree with another 30%. He agree that America would pull back from the world. He's bullish in India. He thinks China will go into the face. Okay, whatever. Even that person who probably might disagree with a lot of this would probably still agree network states and startup societies are cool, right? So you can take mix and match pieces, all right? So with that proviso, let me give a scenario that I think is possible, okay? As I mentioned, American anarchy, Chinese control, international intermediate, re-centralized center. So Chinese control is, I anticipate something like a China coup will be attempted, where whether that is US supported with words or US backed or something, I don't know. The reason I say that, because like Soros has talked about how bad Xi is, folks have like Biden has said, this man can't see in power with Russia. Garside's literally written a book, China coup. I know they took it back or whatever the next day, but like, it's this weird thing where of course they want regime change, but they don't want to say regime, it's geopolitics that's being played out on Twitter. Okay, fine. So do I think that the US establishment may encourage or be in favor of some attempted China coup? I do. Do I think it will succeed? No. And the reason is they're set up to stop that. Like of all the things in the world, that is literally like running the ball straight down the center. They have all kinds of surveillance on this. They have inculcated their entire population against it. They have like 15 different layers. That is not the back door on the Death Star. That's very much like the front door. Okay. They are set up for that. And in the event that that happens, I think they will turn their AI system on the population, rip up civil society by the roots, like have nationalist mobs, crazy things will happen in the event that happens, the China crackdown and China control. And then they will have some software that's like the ultimate coup defeating software, where it's just monitoring the heck out of the population for thought crimes. And then they will export that, unfortunately, to the dozens of countries that are, like basically Chinese colonies or partners. And they essentially promise to those guys who are running African countries or whatever, you will have total order, right? This software and all the drones, China operates it, let us run the mines and stuff. No one's ever going to have a revolution. Boom, right? Okay. That's actually, unfortunately, going to be attractive to many people. It's like total order. On the other side of the world, American anarchy, here's what I anticipate happening. So there's a couple of books. I think you guys had like Stephen Marsh or whatever. I'm probably pronouncing his last name.
Yeah.
Do you have him on the podcast and argue with him?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So Barbara Walter has also written a book in this vein, like, How Civil Wars Start. Are you familiar with that one?
I didn't read that one.
Yeah,
okay,
I read it. Yeah.
Fine. So there's a whole set of, kind of, and the thing is, I probably differ on like 50 individual things with them. Okay. But there's one specific thing, which I think that they are not calculating that I think is going to be extremely important. And that is, I don't think that the coming American conflict is going to be red versus blue. I think it's going to be splash yellow onto it. It's orange versus green. It's going to be Bitcoin versus the dollar. Why do I think that? in the 2010s, just to give a kind of small historical analogy, if you were looking at where the left was going to come from and you looked in the early 2010s, you would have been head faked out by Occupy Wall Street.
Yes.
You would have thought it was going to come from the economic left. And that kind of got beat back. Why? Because there were like civilizational antibodies against communism. And it was just something where it just didn't take in the same way. There's kind of too much of a pushback. It looked too much like something that had been beat. So it was a head fake, and then boom, it came out not on the economic axis, but the cultural axis, right? That was wokeness. All right. With the right, the thing that, Marsh and Walter and so on, I think Walter is explicit about this in the book. They sort of envisioned that a second American Civil War is going to be like the US establishment versus 4chan Nazis. Okay. Basically people who are like the manifesto types, or the thing is in the event that happened, that would be like 99-1 or whatever. It'd be like some tiny, insane, like insurgency without any moral support from the population at large. The message wouldn't travel. Like the entire US establishment is set up to go after basically 4chan Nazi types or whatever, right? Like it would unify the okay. So that's actually not, I think that's the head fake. The head fake is nationalism. The head fake is race. The head fake is the cultural axis. I think where the right is going to come is maximalism, Bitcoin maximalism, the economic axis. Just like the left kind of head faked on economics with Occupy and then came out with culture on wokeness, the right head faked with nationalism and, border control. And that's a cultural right. And it's actually going to come with, ultra libertarian, ultra conservative Bitcoin maximalism. And the thing about Bitcoin maximalism, like, it's so important, and yet it's like totally like people just don't know what the heck it is. Should I just explain it?
Yeah.
The funny thing is, from the outside, like I mentioned this, people from the outside would think I'm a Bitcoin maximalist. Okay,
I did for a while. Yeah. But anyway.
Yeah, sure. And the thing is that if you're a mainstream Democrat, frankly, even a mainstream American, there's a lot of things the wokes are saying. What they're saying verbally is very hard to disagree with. Why would you want to be against discrimination against somebody? Why would you want to be against, when you want to? And the thing is, those words can be implemented in 1,000 ways. It's like, who would want to exploit workers? But then there's a difference between like boosting the salary of somebody and having a communist revolution. And the same words, there's like orders of magnitude in terms of what the implementation and manifestation of them is. So it's very tricky to argue with this, because it's like the words can mean like this enormous spectrum of things, right? Bitcoin maximalism is actually kind of like that, okay? Or Bitcoin itself is like that. Specifically, what is Bitcoin maximalism as opposed to Bitcoin itself? Bitcoin maximalism is essentially the belief that all digital assets other than Bitcoin are sins. Okay, there's different ways of encoding it. I think that's the most concise way of encoding it. And that, if the communists told a history of class and the Nazis told a history of race, right? And the wokes tell a history of marginalization and marginalized groups, the maximalists tell a history of money. Okay. And when I say tell a history of that, I mean, you can literally go through all of history from a class struggle lens, okay, and write books, and all these Marxists have done that. You can do what was done in, Nazi Germany for a while, and even before then, which is go through history and write the whole thing of like the Aryan, blah, blah, right? You can go through history and write it as the marginalized, which is a lot of the woke literature, which is different, by the way, than the class struggle literature.
Yes, very different.
And you can go through history and you can write it as the history of debasement of money and so on and so forth, right? Now, there's this great YouTube video, which is like how wokes and racists are very similar. Have you seen this?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
I know.
You should play it for the, like, maybe at this point, pause, play the whole thing. It's really good. And the reason it's good is it's like several different dimensions where, it's like the ultra left libertarian is the woke, and the ultra like right authoritarian in the political compass. I'm just, you got the political compass. You guys know what that is, right? Of course.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So the ultra right authoritarian is up here, ultra left libertarian is here, but they both on that diagonal, they obsess about race and culture. And like the ultra right authoritarian says this race, the majority race is the best, and the ultra left libertarian says it's the worst. And they get into this weird thing where they're obsessing about the same things, and they end up with like different graduations for Black and white people. You know what I mean? That kind of thing, like this weird thing where they obsess so much about the same things that they lead to mirror image versions of the same practices, right? Practices. What the flip side of that is the communist and the maximalist. Okay, the communist says they hate like certain kinds of economic things so much. They hate all the capitalists, all the rich, and then they basically trust the government for everything. And the maximalist hates certain kinds of outcomes so much that the government can be trusted for nothing. Okay, so it's like the opposite inversion, sort of like the woke. You know, this is like the opposite inversion. And so what's sort of happened is maximalism. What the realignment I project is going to happen is rather than right versus left, where you have like red team on this side and blue team on this side, imagine it as green versus orange, where green are the nationalists and socialists. That's the dollar team. That's the state. That's a legacy government. And orange is Bitcoin, and that's the right and left libertarians. This is not the Reagan coalition. The Reagan coalition was nationalist and capitalist. You know, people talk about zombie Reaganism, right? That was the right-hand side. The Bitcoin coalition is internationalist and capitalist. It is not nationalist, it's internationalist, okay? So it's trade at the top right for the bottom left, okay? So what does that mean? That means you lose a lot of the police and the military and the neocon types, and you know, these colors don't run, you know, like basically patriot, soldier, you know, types. You lose them to you know, the US establishment, but you pick up Jack Dorsey, Glenn Greenwald, and all these folks who are left libertarians who are internationalists and who are, you know, tech founders or they're writers and so on, and they're just disenchanted with authoritarianism, period. And they, you know, they think of Bitcoin and they think of cryptocurrencies as freedom. Now, that whole linkage is still like what I'm describing is a tectonic plate shifting, which is not fully snapped into place. Okay, it's still mid-snap in my view. But the thing is that in the event that this inflation continues, and I think it will, and the reason I think it will is, have you seen the Fed funds chart?
No, I haven't seen it.
So the 40 or 50-year chart of like,
oh, you mean like, do you mean the balance sheet?
Interest rates.
Interest
Right?
rates.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yes. Yeah.
So just take a look at this chart, because the reason is this gives you an intuition that goes beyond our lifetimes or whatever on the long-term trend. Okay. So tell me if you can just pull this chart up. See that?
Yeah, I have it in front of me.
So since basically 1980, for the last 40 years, we have seen like a downward vector of interest rates. It like there are surges up, but if you notice, those surges up are shorter and they go lower before they bring it back down because they need to stimulate again. They need to print again and so on and so forth, right? If that pattern continues, and we will see, the economy is going to get so bad that they're going to be forced to print a lot more money. And at the same time, it's possible that there's some huge, you know, whether they attempt a China coup or whether there's, they're doing something already, you know, the slow steaming regulations, you know what that is?
This has to do with shipping and ESG, right?
Yeah. So all ships are going to be like slowed down by like,
that's right.
In the new year for some like climate thing. And of course, this is in a time when global prices are already high. So you're boosting the price of shipping by some significant number. You're making it harder for goods to travel internationally. And, you know, sometimes it doesn't mean, you know, 30% hike in something may not mean a 30% hike in prices. It may mean a nonlinear impact, a difficult to calculate impacts. Maybe certain businesses no longer become feasible because you need next day as opposed to, you know, 30% slower than that or whatever, right? So we have that. We have the fact that the US doesn't make things and it makes things abroad. And so it's very vulnerable to like physical supply chain shocks and stuff like that. And you have the fact that the leadership, you know, like you saw Bezos is being kind of tweeting at Biden. He's like, yeah, you know, economics doesn't work like this. You can't just yell at gas station owners to bring the prices down, you know? So we have guys who really don't know running things, or at least having people running their Twitter accounts. You have all the physical things being made abroad. You have the ESG things that are, you know, slowing down steaming. You have the long-term trend towards lower interest rates. I think you have something where it's likely that inflation could get very nasty. Who knows? You know, I'm a Bitcoin person, whatever, you can discount it like for that reason, right? But that is what I do think. And I don't know when that happens. It could be this thing. It's like fire, right? When it catches, it could go like this, right? If you look at Weimar Germany and the hyperinflation, it's like this and then goes like that, right? And you'll have people who say, actually, this is good. You know what? All my student loans are gone. All my debts are gone. It's all gone, right? We're all zeroed out. It's like a golden jubilee, right? There'll be people who actually celebrate it, but also everybody whose savings are gone. And there's huge economic instability. Inflation was a huge part of why Hitler arose. And so on. So, okay. So what do I think happens? I think in that time, if that happens, that cuts the last faith in the state for a lot of people. And this is the thing that I think folks like Marsh and Walter and so on don't get, is an enormous chunk of non-white Americans will go into the Bitcoin column. Why? Because they're hit hardest by inflation. And no matter what they say on CNN, if they're saying, oh, actually inflation is not a big thing, these guys have local information. Going back to the Hayek thing, they can look into their wallet. They can see that they have less money. They can see that the guy on TV over there, whatever, is lying to them. And that is something where that's like a part of their base calving off, along with the tech founders and the, Greenwald and so on types. They're losing a good chunk of the elites and a good chunk of their base, a lot of their most like articulate and like powerful like tech guys or whatever. And they're also losing a huge part of the moral authority, right? Because you're losing folks who you're saying you're fighting for, like marginalized people and so on and so forth, right? And now what? Now you've got something where the only thing they can do is just say, hey, look, we've got the flag. We've got the establishment. We've got the dollar. You want to take us into what? Into some crazy Bitcoin world? But this is a new position for the US establishment because for the first time, they're the Inchon regime, right? They're like the guys in the French Revolution who are fighting for the crown as opposed to the revolution. They're like the guys in, Russia who are fighting for the old regime, not the new revolution, right? So it's a flippening where right has become left and left has become right.
I think that's a perfect place to end it.
Yeah, and I just want to, the thing that I think is useful to close on, several things. Like we didn't hit every single thing that Balaji put in the book, but I think the really useful quote you said here is that there's a bunch of nodes here.
Yeah,
there's 100 different nodes in the network state. I think we hit 10 to 15 of them. The last closing that I'll leave people with, and we'll talk about this next time we chat, Balaji. Eric Adams, put aside the dunks people are going to have about the price of Bitcoin right now. Eric Adams taking his salary in Bitcoin. This is a Democrat with like national political ambitions, I think speaks to a resiliency of the political establishment that is going to play interestingly into this.
Yeah.
Same thing goes for Mayor Suarez too. So there's lots of great points, but yeah, let's leave it there. And I suggest that everyone go check out the Network State, which is available for free with all the notes and all the
links in the description. Thank you, Balaji.
Yes.
Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Okay.
It's great. Thanks.
Whew.